Welcome, a very warm welcome to the second edition of Humane Conversations. Since now most of us work from home, we also have much less opportunities to bump into our colleagues and have these serendipitous encounters in elevators, cafeterias, where we get to know also new colleagues and new ideas. And this is essentially why we launched Humane Conversations. With Humane Conversations, we want to create an opportunity and a space for meeting and engaging with researchers that share our interest in and around humane AI. Or maybe having conversations with people you always wanted to meet, but never did. Maybe because they always skip their lunches, or they don't go to the same cafeteria, or because you simply did not have the pretext to approach them. So each month we talk to another colleague from the UvA community and find out more about their research and their perspective on humane AI. Last month we had Professor Max Welling, one of the UvA's experts in machine learning and VP in technology in Qualcomm. We had a very engaged and lively debate about what exactly machine learning entails, how humane AI plays a role, and where not. And you can listen back that interview still via a recording that we have on our website. And Jonathan will share the link with you. And today I'm super pleased to invite Professor Beate Rössler, who has agreed to talk to us. Hello, Beate. Beate has a chair in philosophy and history of ethics. And she also launched last week, together with colleagues, the Platform for Ethics and Politics of Technologies, about which she will hopefully tell us something more in a few minutes. But before that, I would like to introduce my co-host or moderator today, Dr. Balázs Bodó, a colleague from the Institute for Information Law and the founder and director of the Blockchain and Society Policy Research Lab. About communication, so in the last 20 minutes or so, we will open up the floor for questions, but please feel free to already insert comments or questions that you have into the chat, and I will be monitoring the chat, and where questions also directly relate to the conversations we're having, please feel free and to chime in, and I will make sure to attend, Balázs, to your questions and remarks. And with that, and without further ado, Balázs, I give you the floor, and Beate, I welcome you to actually tell us a bit more about yourself.
So should I start or
Beate?
Yeah?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Yeah, I think we owe one notification for everyone attending. We are recording this event, and probably it will be also online via the website of the Humane AI project at human-ai.nl. So if you have problems with being recorded, then this is your moment to stay with us, but be informed. Beate, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much to both of you and to Chris, of course, for inviting me. I feel very honored to be the second in this series. I think it's a great idea to launch a series like that, certainly in times of corona or pandemic, where we, in fact, as Natali says, don't talk sufficiently with one another, only with, I don't know, very strange people on TV or whatever, but not with colleagues from our community. Okay, so I'll first say something about my research and how it developed, and then in a second step, I want to try to link what I do and my questions to what Max Welling said last month, I think, because I think that helps to make clear the differences between the two approaches, if you come from the technology side or the machine learning side, and if you come from the side of ethics. Okay, so how did I start working on privacy? It's very disappointing for some people. I remember a positively embarrassed journalist who was interviewing me about informational privacy when I told him I had started working on privacy from a feminist perspective. That's how I became interested, because I found the difference between private and public in societies interesting, and because this difference is always linked to women versus men, nature versus culture, etc., etc. So I started thinking and writing about privacy, and the topic developed its own dynamics, as topics often do. And I realized I had to write a whole theory of privacy in order to answer my original question. And part of the original question was from the start the role of freedom and social justice with respect to privacy, freedom, and equality. So then the development of new technologies led to the fact that my research began its own life. 10 years ago, everyone was interested in informational privacy, but there were not very many philosophers, certainly not in the Netherlands, or in the Netherlands 2 or 3, certainly not in Germany, who had worked on the topic. So I was more or less forced to intensify and broaden my research on informational privacy, and of course I liked it as well, and its intricacies and ethical relevance. It's very gratifying, of course, if people need your ethical expertise, but in the beginning it was often rather tiring because the translations between the disciplines were so much more difficult. That's really a huge difference than nowadays, where most people are used to working interdisciplinary. That wasn't the case, and I'm sure Claes and Natali remember that as well, 10 years ago or so, or even longer ago. So the next step was with an NVO project on the social dimensions of privacy, and we started to relate questions of individual privacy to the social relations in society. And we asked questions like, what would a society without privacy look like? Why is it necessary for the society that people guard their own privacy and, for instance, don't publish too much on the social platforms? Why is that relevant for the people themselves, but also for society? But also the value of individual privacy in terms of being able to live your own life in social contexts and in very different social contexts. So just like autonomy always is social and relational, autonomy is never lonesome. You're only autonomous together with other people. I can explain that in the discussion if you're interested. So like autonomy is always social and relational, so is privacy. Privacy, I mean, it doesn't make even sense to say of somebody who is completely on his or her own in the world to say she has privacy. Okay, so what lies at the basis, I think, of these questions are always problems of autonomy and freedom, which are connected to social justice and equality. And therefore, I wrote a book about autonomy, but that's not important for this context, I think. So I'll just mention it and don't go further into it. So both areas, I think, the one from autonomy, the one from privacy, led to a new interest, which is at the moment my central research area. And the central question there is, what does it mean to be human in the digital world? Next to privacy, I think this is the research area which is most closely connected to the humane AI. And I think that this is where we have the most sort of topics for conversation. Let me raise here 3 points. And it's here that I'm going to try to link the conversation with Max Welling to what I have to say. Let me first make a general point about the digital society. It's the pervasiveness and the inescapable presence of the new technologies, the digitization of everything, which is so worrying, or maybe not worrying, but which is absolutely new to social life. And maybe I should say something about who am I talking about when I say we in the digital society? I'm mostly talking just about the people I'm talking to, or people more generally in liberal democratic societies. I do think I can claim a wider audience, and I can include many more people, but that's of course contested, and I'm very willing to talk about that. So when I talk about we and here, I'm talking about we in the Netherlands and in liberal democracies. So of course you can say technologies have always influenced human beings or ways of life. I'm tempted to make a reference to Downton Abbey and the invention of electricity in Downton Abbey, but I'm sure not everybody has seen the series. But anyways, electricity and, artificial light in rooms made a very strong impact on social life in general. Also, TV, when it started, was deemed very dangerous because the pictures were moving so quickly and you couldn't really follow. And also, people thought you had to pretend to be in situations where you didn't have any first-person experience from. So that changed the idea of making experiences. You know, I mean, there are colleagues around in Humane AI who know much more about these general impact of technology on human life before the digitization. Digital technology are so much more interfering with all our human practices or everyday life because they concern every aspect of our lives. It's not like, you know, you don't have to use digital electricity or whatever, and even if you use it, it doesn't sort of determine the way you think about the practices you are in, whereas with digital practices, it does. So the general question for me is, how do digital technologies change us and change the possibilities for being human? And how do we understand these transformations philosophically? Philosophically, it's obviously a very broad question, and many philosophers of different approaches have thought about this. Philosophers of technology, from Heidegger to Foucault, from very different angles, but also surveillance studies gives rich material to think about these questions, and obviously also the new and very diverse literature on digital ethics. What these theories demonstrate is, I think, and we can talk about that there's no space, no corner in our life world which is not influenced by the digitalization or the datafication, or however you want to call it, of our lives. That has a lot of consequences, for instance, for ideas of how do we measure behavior, how do we evaluate behavior, and so on and so forth. So we have to look more closely, and this is my second point, to what this means. And my second point concerns, firstly, the specific ways the digital world or the internet is organized, and the new technologies and the sort of influence on our daily lives. So it concerns more directly the role of ethics and politics in the digital society. And here is where I want to set up a continuity between the conversations of last month and today's. And I think Max Welling's talk is really very interesting and stimulating, but it also clarifies, I think, what I think the task of ethics is. So the first point concerns data and the role of data and the possibilities of misuse. Max Welling very much defends the necessity and usefulness of big data. It's only this way, he says, that we can feed our machines such that they learn, machine learning, in the right way. And of course, we have the GDPR, and it's really sort of very nice. I don't know whether Max is here, probably not, but I'm not saying anything which, you know, he couldn't deal with. So it's interesting how he talks about the GDPR, because of course, for some people, the GDPR is really very annoying. You can't do all the things you would like to do. But he says we have to find a way to deal with it, and in a way to get around it, because the sheer amount of data is so important for machine learning. I don't agree with this, and I would like to discuss that. On the one hand, this only means that we need new conception or more successful conceptions of privacy. So more ways to protect privacy and think about the social meaning of dimensions of privacy. But on the other hand, it also shows that if you think about the incredible power the big tech companies have, if you think about the possibilities of manipulation, and that's another topic we can talk about, I think we have to be terribly careful and critical and discuss the political consequences of data collection in a completely, not in a completely new way, but again, you know, connecting to ways in which these have been discussed. Why do we need all these data? Why do we want to have models? Welling says at one point, we want to learn about the future. And of course, we can only think abstractly about the future. Yes, we've been doing that for, I don't know, 2,000 years. I can think really good about the future, very abstractly, But he wants to have models to predict the future. And this form of prediction, as most of you know who have thought about these things, can also be a form of manipulation. Every prediction has this sort of danger. Okay, the next point is that Welling says, and many other tech people, wouldn't even have to quote or to refer to Welling, I only do it because he's in the series. He says that not all mathematical or technological questions need an ethical perspective. Not every AI application has to be checked, he says. Of course, those which have an impact of human beings, they need to be checked, but there are many contexts, so he says, where we only need efficiency and precision. Ethics doesn't come in. He gives the example of a robot dog sniffing cancer in patients. And he says it doesn't have to be fair, it doesn't have to be responsible, it just produces a chip for you, yeah, the operation you're working on. Again, I don't agree. I think the very standards of what we might think efficient or less efficient, and the very aim we are implementing rely obviously, implicitly on certain values. And these have to be checked, to be discussed with a group of other people, not necessarily with ethicists. I mean, you don't have to be an expert in order to have a well-grounded opinion on these things. We have to discuss things like, might there be a difference between women and men in these cancer docs? I mean, what they sniff, between, you know, the color of people and so on and so forth. There's so many things I can, without ever having thought about it, I can think of that there has to be a problem somewhere. So this connects to my last point. Do we always have to have a responsibility check? Welling claims, and he says, so I have often been asked when I design a new algorithm, do you think about the bad impact it might have? And no, he says, this is not something we think about. It's so very remote from what we are doing. And he says, in the same context, it's the task of the humanities to think about this. Welling, to give an example, refers to a PhD student of his working on quantum mechanical problems, and he wants to demonstrate with this example that in some contexts we don't have to think about responsible or ethical AI. This is a different point than the robot dog cancer sniffing point, because there he said, not with every application we ever think about, do we also have to think about responsible AI? And this present point is more far-reaching. I don't need to think about possible bad impact when I design a new algorithm. So the responsibility only starts after having finished it. My view on science, technology, and ethics in a liberal democracy is different. I think we all have the duty or the obligation to, certainly at the university, by the way, to reflect on possible bad impact on social lives. There are no secret spaces where we are free from the obligation of a citizen. The least we can do as citizens and as scientists or scholars is to reflect on what we're doing, constantly reflect and deliberate over what we're doing, if possible, at every stage of our investigations, with others, in groups, if that's easier, but never outside ethics. Okay, that was it. I have more, but I think I should stop at a certain point. But if we run out of questions, I can give you more.
Thank you, Beate. This is super interesting, and I was constantly taking notes while you were speaking. We agreed on a number of topics that we would like to explore with you in this discussion, but you raised a number of others. So I hope to keep this conversation as free-flowing as possible. So I would like to also invite the listeners and attendees to actually type their comments and questions into the chat. We are going to be monitoring and raising those while we speak before we open the floor in the last 20 minutes of the discussion. So where should I start? Maybe can I ask a clarification question, because you raised the discussion of what does it mean to be human in a digital society. And I would like to maybe ask you to speak a little bit more about that, because that also seems to be relevant in terms of what we expect from technology in terms of ethics. And how much we want to represent ethical frameworks within the technology.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So what does it mean to be human in the digital society presupposes some sort of answer to the question of what does it mean to be human? And of course, that question is very contested, or the answers are very contested. You can say, on the one hand, this is an empirical question, yeah? What do we call humans? And then we have to think of sort of limits between humans and animals or whatever. But you can also ask the question normatively, ethically. What does it mean to be human, and what would you need in order to be human, to live a human life in societies or in the world? And this double-facedness of the question, it's mostly been discussed in anthropology or in ethics with, I don't want to give you a history now, but Aristotle has already thought about this question in very interesting ways. And the way I want to, or I'm in fact working on it, is that I distinguish certain characteristics of what it means to be human, and then human in this double idea of this is not a human life, we say sometimes, yeah, when people live in very, very poor or terrible circumstances. So what does it mean to be human in that sense? And then you can think of certain ideas about social relationships. What's a good social relationship? What is communication in the traditional sense? And what does it mean to have autonomy, to live your own life and not the life of others, not a manipulated life, and so on. These all belong to an idea, to a normative idea of what it means to be human. And then you can think about changes in these ways of life. For instance, just to give you an example, which I've used a couple of times, self-knowledge. We always thought to think about self-knowledge, or what it means to know yourself, is part of what it means to be human. Yeah, it's already relevant in Greek philosophy, as you know, but it's relevant throughout the history of philosophy and literature. So nowadays we are confronted with the quantified self. They actually have on their website the motto, self-knowledge through numbers. And I think this is such a clear distinction between the pre-digital and the digital idea of a human or a human life, where to think about yourself means to measure yourself, to sort of, you measure the steps you take every day, and all these things. So it's a self-knowledge through numbers, but not a self-knowledge through deliberation, reflection, communication with others, and so on and so forth. This is the sort of thing I'm interested in. And I think, look, it's not that I think everything is bad in the digital world, yeah? It just, I think where we have to be careful is when these changes lead to something like a less free, a less autonomous life. If these changes lead to an idea of a better, a freer, a more emancipated life, fine with me. But if you look at examples, and if you discuss examples, and that's what I'm doing in my work, you can see that it's sort of sometimes very difficult to tell, is this really what we want? Is this a direction we want to go? And if you think about this, the big tech companies I was mentioning earlier on, how they change our lives, how they manipulate practices, is that something we want? We were the other day talking to someone who thought, oh yeah, never mind. I don't want to refer to too many examples, but there can be something good in this manipulation as well, if it manipulates us in the right sort of direction, yeah? But is manipulation ever good? Can it be good in that sense as the big tech companies do it? I don't know. So that's sort of the way I think about what it means to be human, yeah?
I'm a little bit, thank you. This is super interesting. I was a little bit surprised because I thought initially that you will answer in a different path, referring to the tradition that started, like Marshall McLuhan says technology is an extension of man, and Donna Haraway says there is a cyborg in us. And there is this whole discussion of how being human is actually being post-human, and somehow we are living together or bound together with technology. And I was half expecting you go down in that direction, but I would like to use this opportunity to ask one of the questions in the chat. Judith Muller is asking, what about...
Do I have to read it?
Sorry?
Do I have to read the chat?
No. I'm asking the question, or trying to rephrase her question, is that what do you think about humans in the loop and autonomous systems and the interaction between autonomous systems and human oversight? And I think this is how I can connect these two topics that we have been discussing now. It's like how human is when the AI is very close to the body, or in some cases within the body, or we put our bodies into artificial intelligence systems like a self-driving car. And how is the human in relation to this system?
Well, I don't know how to answer this question in a general way, because what you could say is that it's always better if the human is in the loop. But that's empirically not even true, I think. I mean, we don't have a lot of, or maybe I don't know, or the empirical research on that, but how people react to humans in the loop versus, only computers is very different. And I think that's an important question to ask. In general, I would always try to take a step back and ask what sort of practice is concerned. Yeah, what exactly are we talking about? Are we talking about legal context, completely different than, I don't know, consumers context? Yeah, so I don't think this is a question, as very often in these contexts, which can't be answered in a general way. And then the cars, the automatic cars, are of course another different problem, because there you have to, the very idea is that this car works without a human, drives without a human. So what do we do about the ethics there? Yeah, that's a question. If you do this sort of ethics, you're constantly asked, what sort of ethics should we implement in the car? Yeah, do we have different ethical systems? I think you mentioned that in one of your questions as well. Like, should it be a Kantian, should it be an Aristotelian, and so on and so forth? And you want me to elaborate on that? It's not exactly, it's connected to the first question, but maybe I just say something. I think we have the problem all the time, even in pre-digital society, life world, we also have the problem that people have different ethical approaches, and that sometimes democratically we have to decide which sort of ethics we have to implement. And in general, this turns out to be, and I know that some of my students are laughing now, in general, it turns out to be Kantian, the ethics. Because Kantian ethics is the fundamental right ethics, is the human rights ethics, and so on. And this is what we have to use. It's not possible in liberal democracies where autonomy plays such an important role, such a central role in our thinking, to use anything like utilitarian, for instance. Yeah, well, we just forget about these 5 people as long as we can save this really fantastic famous violinist or something like that. Yeah, we don't think along these lines, and we have good reasons why we don't think about along these lines, so we better stick to them. Yeah, sorry, not very satisfying, I know.
No, but super useful in terms of moving this discussion a little bit further, because you also started when you defined at the introduction that you try to limit your arguments to a Dutch context and the that of the viewpoint of a liberal democracy. But if we start to peel back this very narrow view, we find very different identities, very different people in very different social, cultural, economic positions, with very different and context-specific ethical dilemmas or value systems. And when you just said how difficult it is to actually represent all these different ethical dilemmas within one technical system, this gives me an opportunity to ask another question from the chat. Is like, to what extent one can actually represent all these different value systems in one technology, which oftentimes serves the whole globe, billions of people at a time? And what is the role of an institutional environment around technology to actually enforce or frame ethical behavior or norms around ethical behavior. My impression is that with all the other technologies humankind have developed over history, hardly very few ethical norms are encoded in particular technological artifacts, more like we have grown and developed various institutional frameworks to make sure that they are the practices that you are also talking about are according to certain expectations. So how do you see the role of the institutions within within this framework?
Okay, so let me first say something about value pluralism, because that always sounds as though the values we have, we in liberal democracies, yeah, are so very different from values other people have. Other people, I don't know, in China, well, maybe in China, but I'm certainly not sure. In Africa, I'm certainly not sure. And in India, and why am I not sure? Why am I actually convinced that we do share the values is that the human rights, the very idea of human rights is universal. And it's very contested. I know there have been lots of discussions from the beginning, feminist discussions, other discussions, criticisms, but still it's always the point we return to ask, okay, the right to life, the right not to be tortured, the right to privacy, and so on. And that shows, I think, that it's not some sort of idea of Western liberal value we are defending here. It's an idea of respecting every human being as human being. If we can agree on that, I think we can agree with everybody. We should be able to agree with everybody on that. And I really don't want to downplay the racist consequences the human rights have had, the sort of patriarchal context in which they are applied or not applied for that matter. But as a normative point, it is a system of values where we can all agree upon, as a starting point for further interpretations. And that means that the institutions we need are institutions which in the right way protect or even guarantee the application of human rights. I think that is very obvious, and I don't think my colleague Natali Helberger will disagree, because she is a defender of human rights just as I am. It's not easy, I know that, because the application, as I said, is always an interpretation. So what does it mean to protect privacy? For Max Welling, it means, I mean, even in our little context, it can mean totally different things, yeah? But that is where you get started thinking and discussing and communicating with others about the right interpretation. So we only want institutions where institutions using the technologies and institutions propagating the technologies where we can be sure that human rights are the basis. That's not a lot, but that's something. Does that help? Can I say one more thing on the plurality of values? It's not that the Western tradition hasn't thought about the plurality of values. It's not that, and yeah, it's so difficult to talk about these things because it's very good and very rightly so that they have been, the idea of plurality of values has been criticized, the liberal idea of plurality of values. But I think it should be a criticism from within the idea of plurality of values, not from the outside, yeah? We can say, yes, okay, we have these plurality of values and it has been applied or interpreted always in very patriarchal, racist ways, but let's not go outside the values. Let's not leave respect for human beings, for instance, but let's try to stay in this value system and just clarify what it should mean. Yeah.
Natali.
But thank you so much, Beate. This is immensely relevant. But isn't that exactly part of the problem, that everybody is redefining privacy? I mean, each self-respecting technology company has its own ethics code with its own definition of privacy, and and they all believe that they are squarely within the value system. And another question from Eric Schließer in the chat points also to this direction, who mentioned that he has recently read some computer science literature, and they, for example, or the authors, understand privacy simply in terms of the amount of randomness or noise one has to add to protect the identity of data points. And also in the entire discussion, for example, about the COVID apps, we saw very distinct definitions of privacy. So how much is privacy as a fundamental value and right then still a guidance?
Yeah, look, I totally agree with you. There are very suspicious ways of using the idea of privacy or the value of privacy in order to not protect privacy. Yeah, that's in fact what certain companies are trying to do. But what is our alternative? Our alternative would be to have better laws. We've tried that with the GDPR, and I think it was a progress. Our alternative is to be more critical, to be maybe forbid certain things, so have stronger laws, have stricter laws, or also to have more debates on these issues. There is no, I'm sorry to say that we use this stupid phrase, but I really think there's no alternative. It's not that we can invent a new value. It's not that we can invent a new concept which suddenly suits our problem so much better. That's not the case. This is all we have. And this is the basis of what we have to fight for, you know, a better usage of data, a better society. I really don't know what people think we should do if they say privacy is not respected anyway, so let's forget about privacy. And then what?
Which probably also relates to the distinction between privacy and individual value and privacy as the social dimension of privacy. And that was another question in the chat, fittingly by an anonymous attendee who is protecting his privacy this way, but would like to know from you if you could elaborate more a bit on the social dimension of privacy, which, especially as so many privacy discussions do center around the GDPR, is often neglected actually in the debate.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yes, I obviously think that's an important question, and I think it has different sides. So one side is that the protection of individual privacy, of your privacy and my privacy, is dependent on a society which values privacy. It's dependent on a society which says, okay, everybody's privacy should be protected. If we did not have a society which thinks it's important to value individual privacy, then of course, obviously, we wouldn't have any individual privacy. So that's the first idea. The second idea is that imagine that we don't have any privacy in social context. Imagine that I know everything about you and you know everything about me, and we constantly have to talk about that as well. That's not a society in which we could live something like freedom or autonomy or whatever, yeah? We're constantly sort of confronted with things we don't want to know and we don't need to know. So a society, Daniel Solova has this beautiful expression, a society is suffocating if it doesn't protect individual spaces of privacy. So that's the one side. The other side is that the social dimension of privacy also means that in different social contexts, we have different ideas of privacy. Think about the woman who is sitting with her psychotherapist and she tells her everything, you know, which is terrible for her. The social idea of privacy means that the therapist doesn't answer on the same terms. She doesn't start talking about her father and her mother and whatever. So privacy is here has a very special meaning. And so we have very many different social contexts in which privacy plays different roles and different sort of essential roles. There's also a sense or a meaning of social privacy when we talk about the privacy of groups as a whole. For instance, you can think of teaching contexts, yeah? It's not really a private context, but of course I want the privacy of my classroom protected. I don't want the rector, however nice she is, to listen in on how we teach or what the students say and so on. So that is more a social group privacy, yeah? And that's, I think all these dimensions of privacy are essential for a society to work well, in the sense that it enables people to live their own free, hopefully emancipated lives.
Very interesting points, and I would like to follow up on this in two ways. But before that, I would like to invite again the attendees or the listeners to type their questions into the chat or into the Q&A panel. We are monitoring both, and we try to weave in these questions into the discussion. So one of the debates that was very lively, and also the personalized communication project has also dealt with quite a lot, was related to the use of private communication channels provided by big platforms like WhatsApp. And the problem that within these private communication channels, propaganda is spreading very fast without any ability to actually recognize that this is happening or actually be able to assess the size of the problem. And I was part of a discussion that was taking place on an enlightened US-based international mailing list, where some people actually proposed that because this is such this group privacy, where people were actually setting up these private groups, can be so abused. We should establish some enlightened moderating openness, where we just make sure that this group privacy does not degenerate into horrendous echo chambers. How do you balance these arguments for group privacy on the one hand with some of the very apparent fears that within the privacy of these within the privacy groups can diverge from the social to the extent that it becomes a danger to social cohesion or political stability?
Yes, of course. I'm not so sure actually whether that's a question of privacy or of political influence on certain social groups. I mean, it doesn't really matter what the title of the problem is. The problem is very real, of course. And I think, just like you, I suppose that, of course, to be guarded and to be critical of certainly unwanted political influence is more important in these cases, if you want to weigh it, than the protection of privacy. But again, this would, for me, be the general guideline, and we would have to discuss and to weigh these things. But again, I would say, let's look at the context. Yeah, what precisely are we talking about? Which groups are we talking about? Which sort of political influence are we talking about? That's so difficult with the new technologies, that you have so many change in context, which also go hand in hand with a change in the political or ethical evaluation. I might want to discuss this when we talk about Russia in a different way than when we talk about Texas. And I think that's important. I don't say it's easy. I just think it's important not to try to be universal in this way when we talk about these possible, really, I mean, horrid influences. Yeah.
So am I right understanding you when you say there are all these different contexts and context-specific challenges, and also maybe a value pluralism, which we have to deal with within the framework of value pluralism, when so when there is like ethics by design, or trying to think of algorithms that have certain ethical frameworks built into them, that we will have, or maybe we should think about as many technologies or technology instances as there are contexts?
Well, you know, as long as we can sort of evaluate them on some sort of similar standards concerning rights, human rights, and right to be respected in different contexts, in different ways. I think, yes, well, it sounds a bit weird. I don't know what that means. I mean, Max Welling probably would know immediately what that means. And he would probably be a better conversational partner in this. The thing I want to avoid is that we pretend to be able to weigh these general rights against one another in a universal way. I don't think we can do that. I also don't think, and that's another point in Welling's talk, I don't think we have to make compromises. I don't think weighing rights against one another is to make a compromise. So if we, for instance, talk about the app and the privacy dangers of that app, then we say, okay, we think in this case, security or health is more important than privacy. But to make a compromise would mean to say something like, privacy is not really important here. Yes, it stays important. It is important. This is what it means to weigh rights against one another. We don't say, no, you know, forget about privacy. This is important. We say something like, privacy remains important and has to be checked, of course, every now and then. And we don't give it up in order to make a compromise. See what I mean? And this, again, is not universalizable in any way. Yeah, we can't say, well, in the Netherlands, this has worked really well, so let's apply it to Germany. In Germany, people have different intuitions, different laws, by the way, and so on. Yeah.
Can I jump in on that, or the question of the societal dimension of privacy? Yeah, we've been doing together with Joanna and Jeff, I'm not sure if they're listening, a research into user perceptions of GDPR. And something that struck us during this research is that actually a lot of people indicated that giving up some of their privacy means being part of society, because society requires us to share data, to share pictures of our kids on social networks, to use WhatsApp, to communicate via Zoom as we do now. So ironically, sharing data maybe is what it means being human in the digital society. So would it be maybe good for society to have less privacy? And I mean, I'm playing devil's advocate here, because I think we both think a lot about how to operationalize privacy, but maybe we do need some compromise here, and maybe optimizing for privacy is not always the way to go, because it's not what it means being a human in the digital society.
Okay, great. Yes, of course, that's a very, very good and important question, because it clarifies the fact that we never have a clear line between what's private and what's public. Yeah, this line has always been contested. And if you think about, for instance, the 60s of the last century, when pornography was first really sort of very present in shops, lots of naked bodies, specifically female bodies, very many people thought this should be private. It's got nothing to do with the public sphere. So, and in a way, I think that was very emancipatory. It was also very sexist, okay, but you know, emancipatory aspects, absolutely. Also to think about children's education, yeah, used to be a very private thing, now is a public thing. So what I'm saying is there is a side to the changing line of between privacy and public space, which is very emancipatory, which is liberating also, yeah. So I would never say, no, every publication of data is bad for our freedom and our privacy. No, it's just that we have to be so careful to think about what sort of data are we talking about, yeah? We can't talk about all the data. People want to have their private lives, which is not sort of controlled or watched or observed or whatever by whatever institution. And so it means that we have to, again, talk about the contexts where we think data should be published or data should be shared, and the context where we don't want that. And as long, look, I can decide to publish on my Facebook site, if I had one, whatever I want to. I think there are ethical limits, but probably no legal or almost no legal limit of what I can show about myself. And also this can have, again, an emancipatory aspect when we think about the young girls who talk about their menstruation on Facebook, which was an absolute taboo when I was a young girl, which is now shared freely on the social platforms, and where I would never say, no, that's bad for society, so it depends on what sort of data we're talking about, and it depends on, did the person decide for herself that she wanted these data published, or was it against her will and the state said, no, bad luck, you have to publish these data. See what I mean? And then it can be very, very, liberating even. And if you think that this is necessary in order for your individual feeling, in order to be part of society, fine with me, as long as we're not all forced to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm trying to look at Balázs, if I can ask a very quick question, but he's the moderator, so yes.
Please do.
Yeah. Okay.
I also have a question, and we maybe we get one last chance to put questions in the chat, because we have to round up in 5-6 minutes. So Natali, I have a question. Please, do you want to ask a question? Claes will have a question if I have time. I will have a question. Audience has a question. Natali.
Okay, question away.
Yeah.
Okay, very, very briefly. I was totally triggered by your current research question. What does it mean to be human in the digital world? I think that shows already having a good research question is half the research.
I know.
But being human also means being totally imperfect, right? Because humans like war, they eat too much, they give away their privacy. So what do you think about the value of human imperfection? Is that something that we should still strive for, or try to improve these less perfect sides of humanity?
Okay, look, this is exactly why this question is so interesting, because I don't think anybody ever strives for imperfection. I mean, we shouldn't strive for it. There's no value in imperfection. There is value in, I have as one of the quotes at the beginning of my book, if it ever is finished as a book, a quote from Jonathan Lear, who is a philosopher and psychoanalyst, and he says, we never fit completely, something like, we never fit completely in the practical identities which we have to live. There's always something, not really fitting, not really matching. We always are fighting against the sort of identity we have to live. We're always, imperfect with respect to the identities we have to live. So that's exactly part of what I'm talking about. And why is it so interesting? Because the digital society doesn't like imperfection. The digital society mostly has a yes or a no. Like, for instance, you are probably asked, just as I am, 10 times a day, probably young people are even asked 100 times a day, to evaluate websites. Did you like this? Yes or no? You can't say, well, I'm a little ambivalent. On the one hand, I did. On the other hand, I didn't. That is, ambivalence is, I think, one of the characteristics of human beings. And I'm not being a Western liberal white woman. This is in all the novels you read from all over the world, that people tend to be ambivalent about things. The digital society hates ambivalence, because ambivalence is something between yes and no. And this is just one example why I wouldn't say we strive for ambivalence. Not everything human beings are, we have to strive for, but it is how we are and how we live our lives, our more or less happy lives. And that's why all these digital forms of forcing us to be clear about things, they are, inhuman. I mean, they're not really inhuman, but they're at least in a different way human than we think human life should be. Yeah? Balázs, you?
Place, you?
Yeah, well, I had a question which would take us all the way back. Thank you so much, Beate. And I don't want to do that because I've just seen that Judith Müller has what I think is the much more appropriate closing question, which is the question that I'm now going to post in the name of Judith is what is the most pressing issue regarding humans and AI that needs empirical answers? And my own much smaller and mundane question I will ask you on an upcoming occasion.
So what's the question? What is the most pressing issue in terms of what?
What is the most pressing issue regarding humans and AI that needs empirical answers is Judith's question.
I'm not an expert for empirical answers. I'm more an expert for normative or speculative or something like that answers. But okay, let me think about the meaning of the question in the first place. Why do we need to have empirical answers to all these? I mean, one empirical answer or empirical answers we could now meaningfully talk about to all the technical problems. Like, I mean, Max Welling was talking about the problems surrounding machine learning, which I hardly understand. Let alone, I could say this is the most important one where we need an empirical answer to. So I think this is, in a way, it's certainly a very interesting question, but maybe directed more to the machine people, and maybe also showing, sorry if I say it like this, a certain helplessness in thinking about what's happening with these technologies. The helplessness, I mean, because it expects something to be clear and sort of decidable, where things are not clear and decidable in that sense. Sorry, I would like to see you now. I can't even see you because I only see my colleagues. But anyway, that's sort of the direction I would answer in.
Yeah, this leads to me my question, because if I get the feeling of this discussion right, what I see is that maybe one of the key tensions in technology and ethics questions is when certain groups or groups of people cannot really represent their own values, or cannot really see reflected their own values or in their own ethics in the technical systems that they are using, or they are forced to use, or they have no choice of not using. So maybe that's something for the ethical researchers as well, to see what are the willingness, the ability, the desire of various groups to actually formulate.
Yes. Okay.
And represent.
Yes. I think I totally agree with you, because one of the things I found so worrying actually in Max Welling's talk was that he says, well, at a certain point, he talks about the responsibility people or the ethics people have to come in, as though the technicians do their work and the humanities scholars or responsibility scholars do their work, and then at a certain point we walk in and say, no, this shouldn't be researched, but this should be researched. I think that's a wrong idea of how we want to live in our society. We don't want to have certain free spaces free of ethical deliberations or ethical thought, and free of responsibility and so on. We want to work together from the start. And, you know, I was thinking when he talked about this PhD student working on a quantum mechanical problem, not being worried about ethics at all, I thought, this is bad. At our university, bloody hell, we should have ethics courses for all these students, just to make them think about what it means to think about ethics, not to solve all the problems. We never solve problems. We only show where the problem precisely is and how we should talk about it. Yeah. So I think it's very important to see to see that we're not separated community, the tech community and the responsibility community, but that we are one community, one hopefully sort of democratically organized group of people who think about future technologies. And Natali and Claes and I and you, Balázs, we all think from different angles, and then Max Welling has another different angle. But it's not that one is better than the other. Well, maybe one is better than the other, but no, it's that they all belong together. Yeah.
This is the perfect closing for this discussion. I couldn't have desired more. I would like to use this opportunity to thank again Beate Rössler for being with us tonight. I would like to thank Natali, Claes, also the attendees for their questions. This talk will be available on the Humane AI website. And please join us in December, 3rd of December, Thomas Paul, Professor of Data Culture and Institutions, will talk about the societal impact of AI-driven virtual assistants. Please spread the word of this discussion and the news of the next discussion, and hope to see you soon. And I hope that what Beate said will not just be an aspiration, but actually a social fact. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.